From the United Nations Office to the African Union, this is She Stands for Peace. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, and in this podcast, I speak with thought leaders and peace builders who share their reflections and best practices towards achieving objectives of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Africa. In this episode, I'm joined by Signe Gilen, Norway's Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security. Ms. Signe Gilen joins me from Oslo, and we have a conversation about protecting the participation of women in peace-building processes. So Signe Gilen, it's a pleasure to speak with you today. You took over the role of Norway's Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security in March 2022. So you're a few months into your role, and you have joined in the last year of the period that Norway's current National Action Plan covers. So let's start with your background and work leading up to this role as Special Representative of Women, Peace and Security.
Well, that's a long story. I don't know if you should take the whole story, but basically I have been working in conflict zones and conflict-affected countries throughout my career. I did start as a nurse, and I worked in the West Bank in the 80s. And then I studied anthropology, and I joined the ministry in 2002, I think, around 2002. And I have been serving in and covered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the South Sudan, and also Yemen.
So 20 years of extensive peace and security experience.
Absolutely.
So Norway's current National Action Plan covers 2019 to 2022. So this is its last year, and I presume that you're already working on a final report and also beginning to draft the next National Action Plan. So can you give us some insights on the lessons that you take from the currently closing National Action Plan and this next one, which will be your fifth National Action Plan?
First of all, we will continue the action plan of 2022 into 2023, because we also want to have the whole Security Council period as an example or experience for the next action plan. So we have decided to extend the action plan till 2022, but we do start the work on the preparation of the new action plan this year. And we have also had small evaluation of the development funds being used for the action plan, which has been submitted by institute called EVAL. And then also we are consulting with civil society and others throughout the fall of 2022.
So what are some of the lessons that you've learned in the last few years of this current National Action Plan?
I think I'm very lucky because I'm building on very solid work by my colleagues. I think it's a lot of good things to carry on. We are not a very big foreign service. We are not very many people. We have very close connection between capital and embassies that is engaged in peace and reconciliation work, or which ends up with conflict-related violence within the country or in the region they cover. So I would say that the fact that we have had 10 focal countries throughout some years, we have had meeting points for focal points at the embassies. The ambassadors have had their yearly meeting with the Minister on Women, Peace and Security. All this has sort of, I think, built a quite solid platform of knowledge within our service, and that helps a lot. And of course, people are also moving. So, for instance, those who are covering women, peace and security in our Security Council have also been working on that in country-specific settings such as South Sudan and Afghanistan. So it helps us a lot, I think. And that is something that I think it's important to highlight, that we will never be better than we are on the country level or at the missions. You can have a very sophisticated umbrella, but if the umbrella is not grounded, it won't be that easy to carry out efficient programs. I think also another thing that many of us, not just Norway, but many practitioners are struggling with is, of course, that we have a very solid, I think, normative framework of women, peace and security, but it's all about implementation and how to succeed in the field, and that countries are able to fulfill goals on this agenda. That's a lot more complicated, and with the heightened conflict, not just in Europe, as we have seen with Ukraine, but also 3 regional Africa, in Asia. It's more conflict being built these days than a couple of years ago. So of course this is a very important agenda, and we need to make sure that our colleagues around the globe and civil society and academia do have the resources to develop this field of experience and expertise.
You mentioned South Sudan earlier on, and I know through your National Action Plan and your overall WPS strategy, you do support a lot of African countries. So can you talk us through some of the experiences you've had in the last couple of years working with African countries, especially when you think about the fact that for most of this National Action Plan, there's been a pandemic?
I was working on women, peace and security and on the revitalization of the peace agreement in South Sudan. You know, it was a very harsh fallout in 2016. The parties split again, and then they managed to come together again and did the revitalization of the peace agreement. This was ahead of the pandemic, so I have to emphasize that. But I think the fact that the South Sudanese managed to include more women into the process, they also consulted with academia, and the whole language in the agreement, the paragraphs on humanitarian security, on security in general, on women's participation in economy and so on. All of that was strengthened in that revitalized agreement. When you have such a fallout, it was also a chance to emphasize women, peace and security compared to the first agreement they had. Because on the follow-up mechanism of the first agreement, it was only one group of women that was engaged in the monitoring of the peace agreement. And with the revitalized peace agreement, you have several women and a lot stronger language on women, peace and security within the agreement. And I think, it is parties who create conflict, and it's also parties who needs to solve conflicts. It's the international community is assisting, but after all, it is the parties who needs to agree on how to go forward. And I think that the South Sudanese women from different walks of life, and of course with conflicting interests because they are part of the conflict, they managed to create a broader platform and dialogue. So they also, as a whole, became more, efficient in making sure that they were included. I think one thing is to have it in the agreement. One thing is to be within the process when you are discussing such a revitalized agreement. But it's, of course, also very hard work to maintain and make sure that you have a 30% participation. In areas like the security sector, it's difficult because it's of basically high-ranking officers who will be representing the parties in such mechanisms. So you have issues that is not really related to the pandemic, but you also have, of course, the pandemic who have made it even more challenging, I guess. That said, I think it's very encouraging, like Juba University and the Transformative Leadership Program and how they have been working on this issue of inclusivity. And I heard from some colleagues that they have now 2 master students who doing their thesis on women, peace and security. And it's so important that local knowledge is built, that the academic fields are being built, because of course it's important and it's good to have an international cooperation with the different institutes specify their work on women, peace and security or on reconciliation. But it's also so beneficiary for both countries themselves, but also, I think, for the whole international community, that the knowledge base is built in countries like South Sudan, but also, in general, because they have very close access to data. They have very close contact with, to information. They know the conflict dynamics more intimate and better than most of us. Then it is always a challenge to find funds and opportunities for students to develop their work into master thesis and PhDs and post-PhD, postgraduates and so on. But that's, I think, really part of the things we need to do in order to be more efficient on the ground.
And I can relate to all you're saying about academia and knowledge development, because as an academic myself, this is an area of research that I'm also developing. And in the last year, I've seen a significant increase in number of prospective PhD students that apply to me to be supervised for research into peace and security, particularly around the WPS agenda. So it's interesting that there's that development. And has Norway been supporting these kind of knowledge development activities, research, those kind of things?
We do that in different fields. I don't think we have done it specifically on women, peace and security, but we do have programs that is supporting PhD and master programs. So I think it's a matter for us. It's also a matter of cooperation between universities. But I would also say that it's, for instance, when you are supporting programs like Women, Peace and the Humanitarian Fund of UN Women, you have fund mechanisms that is also important mechanisms. I miss a little bit that kind of opportunity on research and on knowledge building. Because when we are talking about capacity building, we are often talking about capacity building of smaller NGOs or civil society organizations, which is an important topic in itself. But it's different, from building academics with experience or law or anthropology or political science So you need both. And the real knowledge, I think, built in this field is done by the academic institution.
I want to move on to women's participation. So Norway is just over halfway in its second year, in its 2-year membership of the UN Security Council. And of course, currently you hold the Security Council presidency as well. And in its presentation reflecting on the achievements of Norway 1 year since its membership, your predecessor, Andre Mundal, whom I interviewed for episode 7 of this podcast, he highlighted the importance of geopolitics in achieving your objectives. He also highlighted participation as a critical aspect of women, peace, and security agenda, as we all know. And I'm going to quote him. He said that I would hope that the importance of women's participation is a legacy that we leave behind when we leave our elected seat. Nothing can replace participation. There is no other path for success. So that's what he said in his reflections at the presentation. So given that participation has been your key focus on the Security Council, what are your reflections on what you have achieved so far? And looking forward, what would you like to see the wider WPS community, especially in Africa, do better and differently also when it comes to protecting the participation of women in peace building and conflict resolution?
Of course, I agree with André. It's a part of our policy to highlight participation. And we did have quite a lot of civil society briefers in the Security Council in the presidency in January, which I think he commented on. And as you mentioned, it is always this issue of protection of briefers to the Security Council. And I would also say when actors are briefing the Security Council, what kind of impact do they have on the wording or the policies that is being decided through the council? So it's both, participation, and it's also the impact of participation. I think I want to emphasize, because people do take a risk when they are briefing the council sometimes, especially if they come from civil society organizations dealing with human rights and so on, which is quite often a delicate issues, right? I think it's also important the window that has been created in the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund on human rights defenders and peace builders. It's both a window where we are trying to motivate for increased participation so that they can have specific funds to travel, when they need to, because sometimes it comes up on short notice that it's a consultation or whatever. But it's also a matter of protection and to assist people who needs urgent protection financially by traveling, for instance. I think also that this has been highlighted, of course, in Afghanistan, where there have been many people leaving Afghanistan. And then you have the immediate, the focus, which is to protect life. That is the most important. And then also, how do people organize their life after they have left the area? And how is it possible, to come back? Or you can also say, this is Afghanistan. You have it also, I guess, in many other conflict zones, right? Also in Asia, I would say that has been the issue. You see people have left countries who have been under change lately. So I think when we ask about protection, I think that the first emphasis is actually to protect life and to make sure that people are safe. And then it's the whole issue of rebuilding your life from where you are, which is a lot more complicated, right? I think it's a very complicated area, and a lot of work is ahead of us.
And staying on with your time so far on the Security Council, I read a policy brief which was produced by the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, suggesting that Norway had to develop alternative ways of operating whilst you've been on the council. So, reflecting on this, first year on the Security Council, what are some of the alternative approaches to operationalizing Norway's role and commitment to keeping the WPS agenda on the table, especially in this context of your commitment to protect participation, to protect life, and other agendas you have on WPS?
I think we have been instrumental in making sure that we, what can I say, have the foot in the door so people are let into the briefings. There have been also, of course, some are focusing more on side events. We used January when we were in the presidency as the Security Council as the main scene of discussion. So I would say that, changing modality, it's of course because we do have a seat at the council. So I have said that I think we are not better than we are as partners on country level. I think that when you are briefing or when you are in the Security Council, you also need to make sure that the groundwork is being done, in countries, so that the briefers that come to the council and also the follow-up of those briefers is done in the right manner. So again, I am referring to what we do on country level, and I don't see that it's such a big transition. It's just that you have another opportunity to highlight people and actors who really deserve to be listened to, and make sure that they are being listened to on a high level of policy making. So that might be some change in modality, but it's actually just opportunity who have changed when you are in the council. And I think that's very important to. That's an obligation you have when you are in the council, how to make sure that people are being seen and heard.
Now, Norway supports implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in many countries. And in Nigeria, for example, you're contributing $2 million to phase 2 of their MWP's agenda, which includes the development of the country's third national action plan. Norway is also on the board of the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund, of which you're a key donor. And in all this, active engagement with civil society has been central to your efforts. So reflecting on how Norway works with civil society in creating that enabling environment for the protection of women's participation, what can you learn from this and what would you like to do differently and for the wider WPS community to do differently in including civil society in achieving these processes? And I would really love to hear some of your kind of Africa-focused examples of how you've worked effectively with civil society.
I think it's not something that is done overnight. I mean, by the communities themselves. It's not just off the street. It's the processes where very qualified people are being developed and being highlighted. Of course, also, I think it's about, what can I say, a constituency, that people have backing and that people are behind them. In the end, all of this, I guess, is very, it's politics. It's about agency, right? So I don't want to take too big as if it's a result of our work. It's basically a result of the work that our partners is doing in the field. I want to emphasize that first of all, that's what it's all about.
Absolutely. And we see examples, for example, in Sudan, civil society has been instrumental in achieving that civic engagement towards the civilian leadership. And you mentioned South Sudan earlier on in terms of mobilizing around peace and developing the women's agenda and participation in the process. So there's clearly kind of civil society led with your support through that process.
it's a good examples because like in South Sudan, we are part of the Troika. And then when we had the revitalization and we had the fallout of the conflict, and developing of a new revitalized peace agreement, we did have a role as part of the Troika, and we could emphasize the importance of inclusivity. And we could also lend support to those who was asking for inclusivity through our envoy in the Troika, and of course also in our communication with the special envoy of the UN, with the IGAD special representative who was leading the negotiations and so on. So and that is all about diplomatic work and facilitation. And then at the same time, we did support UN Women and Juba University through UN Women, and then also some civil society organizations had collaboration with the partners. So all these three elements was working together, I think, at that time. Again, I think it's how this partnership is happening in the different countries or at the different country level, and then make sure that wherever we are present, at least we can influence the processes to emphasize issues that is important for us and that we think is important for the process. And that's what we have done. I think on Sudan, I think they are in the middle of this process. Women were very active in the last few years. And of course, with a formalized process, it is still important that they are included. And it's also met with the challenges. On Yemen, I think it's the same thing. We are supporting the Yemen government's own national action plan by expertise. So we have been supporting financially, and then also a recruit mechanism to an international expert, but also a local expert on women, peace and security that is aiding the government and civil society through UNDP. And those are our two colleagues doing that is living in Aden and are working in Aden inside Yemen, not outside, not coming and going or doing everything from distance, but actually working with the different ministries and departments under the ministries that is supposed to deliver on the national action plan. But of course, then it's also up to Yemen and the UN locally how they do this. It's not a Norwegian program as such. It's basically to facilitate the resources so people are able to deliver on their own aims.
What about your activities in Somalia? That's an environment, for example, where they have organizations like the Sixth Clan, as an example of women's organizing and participation in the process. What are your reflections on your activities in Somalia?
Well, I think that is underdeveloping, really, and it's also about the possibilities and opportunities, and again, as I said about South Sudan, when you have a change and you see that the process move a little bit forward, that's also the time when you can start engaging. Because very often these kind of conflicts are stuck for some time. Then it's very difficult. And when things start moving, it might be a little bit easier to assist them in a positive manner.
I want to speak a bit more about the pandemic. So in the first couple of years of the pandemic, there was this fear that countries who are key donors for development efforts like peace and security would decrease their contributions because of the economic recoveries that they need in their countries. But Norway wasn't one of them. And in fact, according to OCHA, you gave $862 million to global human efforts in 2021. And this is important because several aspects of your humanitarian strategy feature key elements of the WPS agenda. So, for example, protection against sexual and gender-based violence in conflict. So what, in your view, is the current state of financing the Women, Peace and Security agenda? And also looking forward, what critical gaps would you like to see addressed in the global financial support for achieving participation of women in the peace processes?
This is a very big question and a challenging question. But I think what we started with in this dialogue is basically how do we make sure that the normative language and the structures are being implemented regionally and locally. And I think the whole issue of the resources, it's also about that. How do we enhance activities and initiatives locally from global funds? And how do we make sure that institutions and organization that is working locally is being financed? As we know, it's the same thing I will have been mentioning when it comes to building the knowledge base through academic work. It's the same thing. So I think one of the issues is how do we make sure that the resources, reach the end user and enable those who are really in the within the situation and or in from main capitals to countries, and that I think some of this mechanism, like you have the humanitarian country funds, of OCHA. You have also now the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund of the UN Women. All these activities, and we are talking more and more about localization. I think that's one important step forward. I don't say that it's the whole truth, but it's a very big step forward. But then again, there is certain fields which might be outside of this a little bit, and one of those I think is academia, and that's why I highlighted that in the beginning. That I think it's actually very important to not just deliver services or work through partners to deliver services, but also build the knowledge, solid knowledge based on how conflicts are developed and how conflict solving.
Before I close, I want to touch on what you were saying about localizing the impact and the implementation and the kind of use of these funds in supporting local action. Would you say that the pandemic was really a great opportunity for this localization to happen? Because obviously the pandemic restricted movements in a way, and therefore perhaps limited or it created the opportunity for a more localized hands-on approach.
Yeah, this is also a very good question. When we have been on this Teams world, web world, for 2-3 years, and you notice that, there is a girl from Payas, or there is a girl from Sana, or, Marib is on the link today. I think that the platforms of web seminars have provided some kind of access and a more direct communication than if you had a meeting in another capital or a regional capital, you know what I mean? But at the same time, I do see that it has been a challenge with the pandemic. Like, as I said, we usually have a yearly meeting where all the embassies, or 10 of the embassies focusing on women, peace and security, meet and exchange experiences. It's not the same when we are meeting on a web platform as if we have a 2-3 day seminar and really go into the matters. So I think it's both been a challenge and to put it in a global perspective, think about all the students who have not been able to go to school and who do not have a very strong and built out network of web possibilities and internet. So I think it's a lot of damage, of course, by this pandemic, and that's also why it's good that we are focusing on how to prevent pandemic in the futures, because it has really been a big challenge globally, and it's not over.
So today we've been talking about protection of women's participation in peace building. So to finish our conversation, if there was one action you would like our listeners to take today in relation to protecting women's participation, what would that be?
Encourage women in local community and support them. I think that's very important. I don't think we can underestimate the support some women get from their families or their close communities, and then are able to stand in front of their communities and be engaged. I think that's very important. I also think that it's important to remember that we are talking about frontline workers, They are the one who is truly carrying both the positive steps that is done, but also carrying the burden of conflict. When you are interviewing me as a special representative on women, peace and security, and I have been engaged in conflicts, I also recognize that, as I said, conflict is created by parties, and it's also solved by parties. And for local communities and marginalized part of society, as women sometimes often are in conflicts, even though they can have had a quite important role in peacetime. But when conflicts strive, there is this marginalization of women. It's important for all, both local communities and for us, to support them.
Thank you so much, Signe, Gilen. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for listening to She Stands for Peace, the podcast series where thought leaders and peace builders share their reflections and best practices in the women, peace and security agenda in Africa. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, and this podcast was produced by the United Nations Office to the African Union with the generous support of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Don't forget to join the conversation using the hashtag She Stands for Peace.